I tried to do this message where I felt like we were least likely to have a whole bunch of guests, and sure enough, we have guests here this morning, and that's just how it works. Because you're going to come in and you're going to be like, dude, if that's all they talk about. No, that's not all we talk about. But one of the things we care about around here is generosity. And so we're going to talk about something that Americans just don't like to talk about. The thing is, we've got more of it than anybody else. It's money. When you come into America and people don't talk about it like it doesn't exist, like, oh, we don't talk about that. People from other countries are like, there's more of it here than anywhere else. You guys acting like it doesn't exist? Yeah, we're going to talk about what it looks like to be generous. And when I talk about giving at church, people say, oh, that's all you want to talk about is giving. Well, you may notice I've never actually talked about giving. Our church has been in existence for 6 months. I've never done a message on it. And I'm not talking about giving this morning. I'm talking about generosity. Because I believe that if we are following Christ, it's not just what we give here, it's how we're blessing and generous to our neighbor. And not just at our church, but in our community. How are we making a difference in the lives around us? And so before we ever started this church, about a year ago, we said, what are the things we want to be known for as a church? And you might see our shirts, believe, connect, serve, and those kind of sum up our vision statement. We wanted to be a place with authentic belief, diversity and community, and then radical generosity. This is something we care about. We want to be a place known for what we give, not what we take when it comes to the community. And so next week, we're having a back-to-school drive. Some of you have given toward that. Some of you have purchased some items, and you're going to be able to bring them in next week. And that's a small way that we are generous in our community. I just finished up looking over our records for Q2, quarter two of our church. We've been in existence 6 months now. And in our first 6 months of existence, we've given over $11,000 to missions around the world, to community programs in our own community, and to blessing our community through different programs that we've offered and done for free for the community. That's you. You did that. That may not sound like much to you, but our church doesn't bring in a whole lot of money because we're a new church. That represents over 20% of what we brought in. A large percentage of what we give has to go to taking care of this facility. We rent it every week, and it is not cheap. And so this morning, I want us to look at what it looks like to be generous as a believer and as a church. And what is this thing of generosity all about? So I'm going to invite you to turn to 2 Corinthians chapter 9. 2 Corinthians chapter 9. And while you're turning there, I want to remind you that vision statement for the church, that's all good and great, but if that doesn't penetrate our lives, it doesn't do anything. If I'm not a person with real belief is not something I do on Sunday. Real belief is when I'm faced with a difficulty on Tuesday. I trust God to get me through it. I trust God has made a way for me. I trust that God is trying to grow me through this. That's real belief. It doesn't just happen on Sunday, it happens all week. Our goal isn't just for our church to do these things. Our goal is for you as a believer to do these things. I want you to have real belief and faith in Jesus Christ. I also want you to understand diversity and community, not just on Sunday. I don't want you to go around saying, yeah, well, I go to a church where not everybody looks alike. No, I want you to live a life where some of your friends don't always look alike. Some of the people you trust don't always look alike. You live a lifestyle of trusting and loving people who don't always look like you, talk like you, or come from where you came from. I want you to live that life. And thirdly, I don't want you to just be generous at church. I don't want you to just stroke a check when we have a big need for a back-to-school drive or for the food bag. I want you to be generous at church, and I want you to be generous around town. I want you to be generous when you see people in need. I want you to be generous when there are community needs that you can help facilitate. And so this morning, it's not a top-down, this is what our church is. No, this is what we as believers are trying to do. So what is our goal here? Our goal is for us to be mature believers who love the people around us wherever we are and are generous with our talents, with our time, and with our treasure. And so I'm going to read to you a passage that was written to a church that had been through a lot. I love reading about the church at Corinth, and here's why. It is the messiest, craziest, wildest church you'll ever read about, okay? They had everything going on. This is actually one of the longest places that Paul stayed when he was planting churches. Over 18 months he stayed in this one place. Most of the times he was just there a few weeks, a few months. He stayed there over a year. He and some quality leaders planted a church. And you would think because he spent more time there, this church would have it all together, right? No. They were a mess. They had everything from sexual sin to pagan rituals working their way into the church to all kinds of hatred and lying and divisions. But in the midst of their mess, they were growing closer to God, And there were some places where Paul would say, you've got to correct this. This is evil. This is wrong. And there were other places where he'd say, but you are good in this area, and I want to encourage your giving. I want to encourage your love for your community. And they moved forward. But in the passage we're about to read, there's a very specific problem taking place in the early church. And I don't mean at Corinth. I don't mean at Jerusalem. I mean the entire early church knew of this one great need. The believers at Jerusalem had more poor people coming in to be taken care of than they could take care of themselves. There wasn't enough money to take care of all the widows and all the orphans that were being neglected in the city of Jerusalem. And so the church at Jerusalem needed a large sum of money to bless its community, and it could not raise the funds in-house. So what they did was they sent out some word, and they sent out word to churches that were only a year old, that were only 6 months old, like this church were only a few years old. And they said, we have got to love the community we've been called to, and we are unable to do it at this point. And so Paul starts writing letters to all the churches, and he says, we're going to take up a big one-time offering to make a difference in Jerusalem. And he writes to them, and he says, I'm coming to you, leading up to the passage we're about to read. He says, I'm coming to you, and I want you to be prepared to give in a generous way. And I want to remind you some things about this church in Corinth. It was not a wealthy church. Some people estimate at this point it was probably around 40 to 150 people. That's a lot of give or take, but we're talking about 2,000 years ago, and a lot of church history has fallen through the cracks. But we know it's an average-sized church, and here's the deal. The majority of them were former slaves. They were not wealthy individuals. But we do know that a city administrator went to this church, because he's mentioned, and a few other high leading individuals in that city went to church there. So this is why they had a mess. They had a lot of tension because there was poor and there was wealthy. They had a lot of tension because there were Jews and there were Gentiles. And I say this all the time. The thing I love about Restore, if you want to come to Restore and everything be easy peasy, you're not going to enjoy it. All right? There's going to be tension here. You know why? Because we've got people from different backgrounds who don't always agree, don't always see eye to eye, and don't always understand each other. And that's okay. Through that mess, we are growing to be more like Christ. Christ has not called me to be just like my culture. He's called me to be more like him. And when I'm around other people who don't always look like me, talk like me, act like me, I realize that the church is not one-dimensional. The church is not just who I am or who I look like or who I come from. And so this church was wrestling with these things. And Paul says, I want to call you to be generous. And it wasn't just generous in their community, generous in a community that, to be honest with you, was pretty hateful to their community. The city of Jerusalem would have been a very religious center, a very, very closed-minded center when it came to Gentiles. This was a place that was very, very closed-minded in who was allowed to come into the temple, who was allowed to be a part of society there and part of culture. They wanted to rid themselves of the Roman influence. Corinth was a pagan city, filled with all kinds of Gentiles who knew nothing of Judaism and didn't care. And Paul says, well, we're not united by culture. We're not united by skin color. We're united by Jesus. And these are your fellow brothers and sisters, and we need to do all that we can to take care of them. Can you imagine taking up a love offering for a group of people who 5 years ago could care less about you, didn't know your name, didn't care at all about your society, and would willingly say, your society is awful and wicked and the world would be better off without it? And these individuals, they cared enough and they were going to do that. They were generous. So I want to read to you in 2 Corinthians 9 what Paul says to them. Read in verse 6. He says, but this I say, he who sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and he who sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. I always do this, I'm sorry. Can I put an asterisk? We're not a name it, claim it church. This isn't a prosperity gospel. Paul's not saying if you give $10 this week, you're going to get 30 next. He's not saying if you give a lot this week, God will give you a Benz next. That's not the gospel. And I know it's funny, but it really does. It bothers me because this is the gospel that is spreading in America. Because America has begun to worship materialism and we've put God and money on the same level, and that is not what this is about at all, okay? So please don't walk out of here saying, well, Mark said I need to sow sparingly so I can reap. No. What Mark is saying is this is Paul writing to this church, and this was just something he said to encourage them to give. But he never said, if you give 100 here, God will give you 200 there. And we're going to get into that. Verse 7. So let each one of you give as he purposes in his heart, not grudgingly or of necessity, compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. This is why I do not get up and say, you have to, you must, you should be giving X amount, X percent, X whatever at our church. I don't ever want to compel you to give, and here's why. I don't have to. The Bible tells me the Holy Spirit does that. He's a lot better at that than me. He's a lot better at reminding you at 2 a.m. about things than I am. I will never call you or remind you of anything at 2 a.m. God is not about me getting up here and guilting and tripping you out on what you should or haven't. Now, there are some principles I think the Old and New Testament are clear on. There are some principles that I apply to the way that I give, the way that my wife and I give. But God says, not out of compulsion. Notice the next phrase. For God loves a cheerful giver. I don't want you to ever come to our church and say, well, I have to serve. When we talk about generosity around here, we always make it up and say these 3 things. I want you to be generous with your time, I want you to be generous with your talent, and I want you to be generous with your treasure. Because a lot of people come to church and think, well, I wrote a check, so I'm good. Or I serve, so I'm good. Or I give time or talent. God expects us to be giving of ourselves. Because we were not placed on this planet to consume. We were placed on this planet to contribute. And this is the great problem with many people in this country and around the world. We've bought into the lie of materialism that my life is complete when I have, when I own, when I've done, when I've experienced it, when I've tasted. And you'll chase that for the rest of your life. Because you will never have enough. You will never own enough. You will never be worth enough. But when you contribute and you give and you mentor and you encourage and invest in others, there's a switch that's flipped. And it makes a difference. This week, I went camping in Maine, and it was a great trip. My wife and I have been looking forward to going to Acadia for years. We went up there and we camped. And we didn't have any internet. We didn't even have any power. I mean, we couldn't even charge our phones. I was really freaking out, didn't know what I was going to do. And so we had no internet, no TV, right? And so we're just hiking and camping and eating. And you know what's funny? During those 5 days when I didn't have advertisements in my face all day from Facebook, during those 5 days when the television wasn't telling me that I needed a bigger truck or a bigger house, during those 5 days, I mean this, during those 5 days, you know what I was content with? Camp food, sweaty hiking, and a tent in the woods. But a funny thing happened on our way home Friday and Saturday. I got cell service back, right? And Facebook knows what I search for, so it therefore knows what I might be interested in purchasing, and it therefore knows what it should show me that I might want. And this thing came back, this desire in me to have a nicer, you fill in the blank. For me, it's usually a truck or a boat or something, And it's this thing where I look and Facebook says, you need this, you want this, you should have this. And I know the drill. I've been down that road before. I've had my truck since 2005, and I remember when I purchased it thinking, life is good. This truck is going to satisfy every need of Mark Neppel's heart for the rest of his life. I love this truck. You'd be surprised in 2 years how much you don't love that truck. You know what I'm saying? A few dents, a few dings, a few things stop working, and you just hate it. But we know that materialism is empty. We know, and yet we allow it to suck us dry over and over and over. And so what God says is, I want you to be a cheerful giver, not somebody who does something out of compulsion. Can I be honest with you? If we're honest, materialism is a compulsion. It's a knee-jerk reaction. It's going to satisfy me during this moment, maybe this year, maybe this week, maybe this month. Let's move on. In verse 8, and God is able to make all grace abound toward you, that you, always having all sufficiency in all things, may have an abundance for every good work. He said, God's going to make it to where you're self-sufficient so that you can take care of every good work. Not so that you could have every nice thing. Not so that that church would have every great building, great staff, great whatever you might think a church should or shouldn't have, but every good work. This church in Corinth was very similar to ours. Based on the reading of Corinthians, 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians, you find there's a differentiation between where their church met and a home, because they started in a home, but at this point, they seem to have some type of a rented facility. Does that sound like any church you know? And we don't know what it was. It was probably a dining hall or maybe a local meeting house inside the church, but they rented it to meet as a church, and then they broke bread in home to home. It sounds a lot like our church, and here's the deal. Paul didn't say, you guys need to raise money so you can build a building. He didn't say, you guys need to raise money so you can have an excellent staff, so you can have really cool marketing, cool logos, cool videos, cool stuff. You need to be generous so that God can help you be self-sufficient for every good work. And this morning, I want to talk to us, Restore Church, about what it looks like for us to be self-sufficient, to take care of every good work. Their church was called to a different work than our church. They're in a different community, different time, different everything. But the Bible's the same, Jesus is the same, and we are called to do good work in our community right here. We live in a community with very specific needs, and I believe God has called us to partner with the food bank. I believe God has called us to partner with other nonprofits that we partner with to make a difference in our world. But here's the truth. God expects us to be generous. Why? So that we can be self-sufficient. I've said this a few times. Our church's goal over the next few years is to be self-sufficient. Right now, we have about 100 different churches that give together so that we can make sure that we're taking care of our expenses. Thankfully, over the last few months, we've begun giving in such a way that we're able to take care of our own rental facility. We take care of the cost of this. I say we, mostly you. We give together, and as a body, this church gives so that we can take care of this. And that's awesome. But I have to remind you of something I told you a few weeks ago. We signed a lease with the Virginia Sports Hall of Fame through July 31st of next year. And after that, our future is uncertain. We will have to move, go somewhere, find something different. Will it be a facility we own? I don't know. Will it be something we lease? I'm not sure. Will it be something that's old and cathedral-like? Maybe, I don't know. Will it be an old warehouse we convert? Could be, I don't know. But I know this. I'm not going to get bogged down in the specifics of the kind of building I want, the desires I have, and what it needs to look like. And here's why. Because that's not the every good work that we've been called to do. That is a tool we will use to do good work. Do you understand? It is a tool we will use to have worship, to make a difference in our community, to reach people and to encourage people, but it is not the end-all, be-all. This church has not ever been, and it will never be about where we meet. It's about what we're called to do. And we are called to be generous. And so I want to look at what that looks like this morning. For us to be a generous church, we need to be making an impact in our community, making a difference. And here's what that requires. 3 things about generosity this morning that I want you to understand. First of all, generosity requires faith. Paul was not saying, wait till you have it accrued and then do it. Wait till it all makes sense and then do it. He said, no, be generous. Why? Because verse 8, and God is able to make all grace abound towards you, that you will always have all sufficiency. I want our church to be self-sufficient, but I know that's going to take faith. It took faith for us to invest in our community when we didn't know if we were going to have enough to pay for rent. That has happened a few times here, and every time I've done that, do you know what happened? When I wrote a check, when I did something with the finances of the church and I knew it was going to be close, we'd get a check in the mail, one time for $5,000, one time for $4,000 to help us cover rent, because God is going to take care of us when we are taking care of our community and when we are investing in generosity. And I know that's really easy to get behind, but here's where it gets personal. The same is true for you and me. I remember being 21, a newlywed, and trying to figure out money. And I remember looking my wife in the face, and this was our goal. I said, I just want to get to the point where we can eat out and not have to balance the checkbook and make sure we could do it. You know what I mean? That's what I want to do. I want to know we have enough money in the checking account to eat out. 31-year-old Mark has a lot of things he can do that 21-year-old Mark thought would make him happy. And you know what? Sometimes it just still isn't enough. Isn't it funny how materialism works? But early on in our marriage, we took some steps of faith, and we said, we're going to give even when it doesn't make sense. We're going to give. We're going to be generous to the church. Why? Because we want to be cheerful givers. We don't want to do it out of compulsion. And we love God's church. And God has blessed us to where we can be generous. But why did he do this? Why? So that I can have nice things? No, why? Verse 8, so that you may have an abundance for every good work. Understand this. Generosity will always require faith. It's never something that makes sense. If in your mind generosity is giving out of your abundance, I want you to understand, and I mean this with all due respect, you don't understand generosity. Generosity is being generous when it doesn't make sense. Generosity is giving to that individual, to that need, when you don't know how you'll cover it. And then thankfully, there are people in this room, you can cover needs, you can take care of expenses, you can do things for people. And I'm not saying that's not generous. What I'm talking about is a generosity that requires faith, that takes it to the next level. When you decide that you're going to trust God and you're going to depend on him, that's when things begin to change and your view of giving and your view of God change. He started out by saying, don't give begrudgingly, don't give out of compulsion, but be a cheerful giver. And the difference in those two attitudes is how we view God. Because when we come to church and we give, we can either say, God's taking this from me, or we can say, I'm cheerful and I'm giving because God has blessed and provided so that I can give. There's a difference. I view God as a giver or I view God as a taker. And your theology really boils down to, do you view God as a giver or do you view him as a taker? I believe God gave his son, right? I believe God gives salvation open-handed. I believe he gives us eternity. I believe he gives us joy, peace, love, hope. I believe he gives. That's what I believe about God. I don't believe he's a taker. But if we allow ourselves to view money as the end-all be-all, then it may feel like God is taking. And that brings me to the second important understanding of generosity. Generosity kills materialism. This is tough to understand. This is tough to do. But if you want to kill materialism, and I do, I don't want to be the guy that sits around and thinks of all the things I don't have. I want to be the guy that sits around and thinks of ways to bless people with what I do have. Because if we're honest, and this is where it gets difficult, this is where we don't like to think. If we're honest, every one of us can think of people who have it worse than us. If we're honest, every one of us can find people in need in our community, in our neighborhood, in our city, and around the world who would love to trade spaces with us. They would love to switch with us. But we don't do that. We watch TV and we see people who have just a little more than us. They're a little prettier, they're a little thinner, they're a little cooler, they're a little younger, they're a little richer, and we want that. And what we do is we rob ourselves of life because we spend our time wanting something we don't have instead of being thankful for what we do have and investing and encouraging those who would love to have what we have. If you want to kill materialism, you've got to start to view money for what it is. It's a tool. It's not something to be worshiped. It's not something to be chased. It's not something to give your whole life to. It's something you can use. And you can use it to do so much good in our community. One of the reasons that we have partnered with the Food Bank of the Southeastern Virginia is because they really use money wisely. They have taken money and they have found ways to stretch it so far. Basically, if I walked into Kroger right now with $10, I could buy some groceries with $10. But because of the network and the connections that the Food Bank of Southeastern Virginia has, when they walk into Kroger with $10, when they contact their network, they can take $10 and purchase $60 worth of groceries. So our money that we invest at the food bank, it gets stretched there. You know why? Because they don't love money at the food bank. They view it as a tool to be used to bless the community and to engage the community and to shape the community. Something that can be done good with, not something to be hoarded. And so they don't turn in their books every year and you see that you gave $100 and thankfully, the food bank has millions of dollars stored up. No. They're constantly using that money to purchase food at discounted rates to bless the community. They get what money is. For me and you to get materialism out of our head, we've got to understand that money is a tool, not an idol, not something to be loved or worshiped. And that's not going to happen this morning, probably. It's not going to happen because I said a few things. It's not going to happen because you had a light bulb go off. That's going to have to be a process. And it starts with generosity. When you begin giving and seeing a difference made because of your giving, you begin to understand that money hoarded can only do so much, but money given, whether to church, whether to the food bank, whether to Edmark, whether to you name the nonprofit, it can make a difference and it can change your world. And that feeling, it is more blessed to give than to receive. That feeling when you give someone a Christmas gift, that feeling when you give, that feeling, it feels good. That's the feeling of materialism leaving and generosity sinking in. But it's a vicious circle. It's something that's a constant battle. And that brings me to the final truth about generosity. Generosity Though it requires faith, and though it kills materialism, it also builds faith. Do you see this vicious circle here? It's a constant tension. You got to have faith. It's like looking down that ledge, looking down that wave. You got to pop up and surf your way down. It's incredibly scary, and you don't know what's going to happen. And it requires faith, but then you stand up and you do it, and it kills materialism, and it builds faith. And then you begin the circle in the right direction. You can use the vicious circle of materialism where you buy, are dissatisfied, buy, are dissatisfied, buy, and that's a vicious circle. Or you can use this circle of growth, where I'm generous, whether at church or in my community or with those around me, with people in need that I come into contact with, and I see it make a difference, and I see it do good, and it builds my faith. It builds my faith because God not only made a way for me to give, but now I'm not lacking. I'm not going without because I started giving. People use verses like this and they say, well, if you give sparingly, God's not going to bless you. And if you give big, he's going to bless you. Right, he will. But let's talk about that. I said we'd get to that, and we are there. What does that mean, Mark? What does it mean that if I give, God blesses me? It does not mean tit for tat with dollar for dollar, cent for cent. It's not what it's talking about. I love what I heard years ago. I was a teenager. This lady talked about it. She said, I came to church and I said, I'm going to step out in faith and I'm going to start giving what I can. And God blessed me. And she said, I'm here a year later and I don't have any more in savings than I did last year. I make exactly the same amount of money I made last year. She said, I hear people talk about when they gave, they got a raise. When they gave, they found money. That didn't happen to me. None of that happened. I make exactly what I made. I save exactly what I saved, and I have the same amount in savings. But my relationship with my husband has grown over the last year, and we are talking with our kids more than we've ever. And so the blessing that God gave me is not what everybody else is talking about. It's what I needed. It's what I desired. And she said, and in spite of that, she said, it's also incredible that I started giving and I haven't had to dip into savings. It's not that God gave me more money. It's he provides a way for me to be generous. That's what this verse is all about. It's not saying God's going to give you more than you had. It's saying he's going to provide a way for you to be generous. So what does it look like? What is our goal? Man, I love ending talking about what it looks like for us. Where do we go with this? I want this place to be a place where people come and yes, man, they have real faith and they are filled with real faith and they walk out of here not just having diversity and community on Sunday, but all week long. And they're not just generous here. I don't want you to walk out of here saying, well, Mark said I need to give at church. That's only a part of it. Paul was calling them to a generosity in spirit that would permeate their life throughout the week. I want us to be a place where people are known for their generosity on Sunday and Tuesday morning. On Thursday afternoon, when they see people in need, they do what they can. They go out of their way. When you see someone having trouble paying for their groceries at the grocery store, it is not a question, you will step up. When you see someone at the gas station who barely has enough to get $4 worth of gas, you offer to fill their tank. When you see someone struggling at Food Lion or at, let's say, Burger King to get enough food for their kids, you pay for their kids to have a good meal. You are looking for opportunities. This is not something that just happens when I feel like it. This is a lifestyle. And this is something that has to turn a corner. Because right now, if we're honest, a lot of us, we're wrapped up in materialism. What I want, what I need, what I gotta have. And we've got to break out of that and go from every day saying, my day would be better if I could have this, to waking up every morning saying, this day would be great if I found someone to bless. And let me rock your world a little bit. If you start praying that prayer, God will line people up in front of you at Food Lion. God will line people up in front of you at Burger King, and he will make it a way. It's what we pray for. If all I pray for is what God will give me, man, we've missed it. God, give me opportunities to give to others. God, give me opportunities to be a blessing. That is the prayer that God aches and longs to hear from a believer's heart. He is so tired. He is so tired of American believers praying for more stuff. I am so tired of being an American believer who wants more stuff. When there are people in our community in this zip code they don't have what I have. I want to be generous. I want to be generous at church. I want to be generous around town. But God's got to help me and he's got to help you. put materialism in its place. And it's difficult because our smartphones are always on. We're getting bombarded with what we need and what we want. But I promise you, just like that vicious circle is hard to get out of, once you get in the circle of giving and being generous, it is just as addictive. It can change and transform the way you view money, the way you love people, and the difference that you can make in your community. So this morning, I'm just going to ask you, what does generosity look like to you? I know what it looks like for me. See, I was raised in a very churchy background. I grew up in the church. It was pounded into my head at a very young age. You need to give 10%. And so that was just something that was understandable and put in there early. And so it's always been something that Casey and I, we understood, we believed. And you can argue over whether or not it's Old Testament or New Testament. I'm not interested in that. I know for me, there are ways that I can give that go beyond just tithing at church. That go beyond just, do I give and support missions? Do I give and? If I'm honest, there are some things that I could go without, that I could do without, so that I can invest a little more this year than I invested last year. Here's the truth, and this is where you get uncomfortable and you don't like what I'm saying, but it's okay, because I'm uncomfortable and I don't like what I'm saying. Because it changes the way that I live. Generosity isn't a percentage. Generosity is not a number. Generosity is growth. There are years that I can give more, and there are years that I try to give more, but my income didn't go up. And so I have to find new ways to be generous. Maybe I had more time this week. Maybe I had more time this year. Maybe I had more talent to share. Maybe for you, it looks like mentoring one child after school, joining a big brother, big sister club. Maybe for you, it means volunteering a little more, whether it's with the food bank, whether it's with the church, whether it's with your community center. But I would beg you to stop viewing what is necessary and start viewing, how can I give? I don't want to be a church. I don't want to go to church where we say you have to do this and you have to do that. I want to go to church where people say, I want to give, I want to serve. I want to give my time, my talents, and my treasure. But that can only happen when we allow ourselves to be freed of materialism. Now, you may walk away from this message saying, boy, Mark doesn't think we should have things. That's not it at all. It's not it at all. I understand we need things. I'm very thankful this morning, for instance. My truck is not strong enough or big enough, whatever that says about me as a man, okay, to pull the trailer for the church. It's just not. It's a 6-cylinder, okay, whatever. But I'm thankful that Terry has a hauling business, and Terry has a big truck, a nice truck, real nice. And he was able this week to pull the trailer for us. Do you know why? Because Kevin went on a family vacation, and Kevin's truck's bigger than mine, so Terry stepped up and said, man, I can take care of this need for you. And he did a great job. He backed it in so perfectly. We were like, did you come up here on Friday and practice that? That was a little too angled. You're just right. And he said, man, this is something I have that I can do. When you and I begin understanding, it's not about robbing ourselves of things. It's not about saying I can't have things. It's about saying, I have some things. I have a home. I could open it up for small groups. I've got a car. I could give them a ride. I've got a little extra over here. I could help them cover groceries. It's about viewing what we have in the right perspective. I'm not telling you to sell your house. I'm not telling you to abandon all your cars and give the money to charity. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying view your life, your income, your wealth, your tools, your resources in the right perspective. And when you do that, you can be generous in such a way that we're able to perform every good work. And I promise I'm almost done. I see what time it is. But our church has been called to perform good work in this community. And what I want you to understand is this: when people give at our church, we are very careful with our money, and here's why. Because we want to spend every dime wisely. Because our number one goal, our number one good work here is to reach people for Jesus. And in the first 6 months, 32 people have committed to follow Christ right here. So what I want you to understand is this: that should build your faith. When we give and things like that happen, you should know when I give to Restore Church, they're using my money to reach people, because that's what we're using our money for. That's what we're doing with it. And that's going to be our goal moving forward. If we can find a space to lease cheaper, that's fine. If we find a bigger space for more, whatever it looks like, we're going to be using it to perform every good work. And I believe this, and I want you to hear me, Restore Church. The next 335 days are going to be stressful. They're going to be faith-filled days where we're stretched thin. We don't know where we're going yet. But I believe God is going to open up a facility for us to use to perform every good work he's called us to in this community. But it can only happen if we're generous as a church and we're generous as believers. Let's not pray for God to send us a benefactor from outside. Let's not pray for God to let us find $1 million in our midst. We're going to be making some big financial decisions in the next 335 days. And I believe God is calling us to begin to be self-sufficient so that we can perform every good work in the Portsmouth community, in the Hampton Roads community that he has called us to do. I say this a little hesitantly. The next 335 days are going to build our faith, but they're going to require a lot of faith. They're going to kill some materialism in me. There's going to be some things I would like to have in another facility we may not get. There's going to be some things we're going to have to put up with, but we're going to grow, we're going to adjust, and we're going to perform every good work God has called us to do in this city, in this community. Would you pray with me? Jesus, I know we've talked about a pretty awkward topic, and people get weird, and I'll probably get an email or two, and that's okay. But God, this morning, we're reading about a church in Corinth that was just trying to get their act together. I don't laugh at the sin. I don't laugh at the evil that had crept in, but I laugh at, God, how you can use such broken people to do such beautiful things. And God, this morning, I see a little bit of Corinth in us. We've got some rough edges. We've made some mistakes early, and most of that falls squarely on my shoulders, and I apologize. But God, in the midst of it, you've called us to do some good work, some great work in our community. And I believe that, Lord, we are going to be generous to our community. We're going to be generous as individuals in our community and in our church community. And God, I pray that your great name would be made great in this place because we're generous, because we're faithful, because we love people from every background. So God, I pray that you would let this message hit home where it needs to. And I pray that you would remind us that we are called to be generous because you are a generous, generous God. When we had nothing to offer, you gave us Jesus. When we had nothing on our own merit, you gave us free salvation. God, you gave us free life, new hope in you. And God, I can never repay, I can never thank you enough for that. So I thank you that you're a generous God and you want me to be more like you. So God, I pray you would help me to be a generous pastor, a generous husband, a generous man. And I pray that we'd be a generous church filled with generous believers. God, I pray that you would do this. In Jesus' name.